January 1944. Camp Kenedy, Texas. The German teacher stood motionless as the American officer delivered news he couldn't comprehend. "We want you to teach the children," the officer explained through an interpreter. The camp commandant believes education shouldn't stop because of war. After 8 months in captivity following his unit's surrender in Sicily, Hauptmann Werner Hoffman had expected many things: interrogation, labor, perhaps even punishment, but never this, an invitation to continue his profession, to teach German children using American resources. Across American prison camps that winter, the U.S. War Department faced an unexpected challenge. Among the 372,143 German prisoners held on American soil were 258 identified educators and a growing population of children. These weren't just soldiers, but families, the dependents of German military officers, diplomatic personnel, and civilian specialists captured throughout occupied territories and transported to American soil alongside their fathers and husbands. The mathematics of war had produced an unexpected equation: enemy children requiring education behind American fences. The small classroom building near the camp administration office contained what seemed impossible luxury to Hoffman's war-weary eyes. 24 polished desks arranged in groups rather than rows. Bookshelves stocked with volumes in both English and German. Colored chalk, reams of blank paper, pencils, maps, and globes. The windows allowed natural light to flood the space, a stark contrast to the blacked-out, often damaged schools of wartime Germany, where classes occurred in shifts when they occurred at all. "You'll have freedom to develop your curriculum," the American education officer explained while Hoffman examined the room, "though we'll need to review your materials." This concept, pedagogical freedom under light supervision, contradicted everything Nazi educational doctrine had demanded. Since 1933, German teachers had followed rigid ideological guidelines, teaching from standardized texts that emphasized racial hierarchy and military glory. Here, behind barbed wire in Texas, an American officer offered what German educators had lost years earlier: professional autonomy. Nazi propaganda had prepared German prisoners for American educational barbarism. Hoffman had been shown films depicting American schools as chaotic, undisciplined environments where children learned nothing of substance or discipline. Instead, Camp Kenedy's school facility rivaled the finest pre-war German academies. According to War Department records, each internment camp with more than 15 school-aged children received dedicated educational facilities built to the same standards as American rural schools: electricity, proper ventilation, adequate supplies, and trained supervision. The systematic education of enemy children began as practical necessity but evolved into something more profound. As Hoffman would later document in a letter smuggled past censors, "They have asked us to teach as we would in a free country, not as we were forced to teach under the regime. This request itself is the beginning of our re-education." This confusion about American educational philosophy began the German teachers' journey toward transformation. Military records show that by February 1944, 27 camp schools operated across the American POW system. These facilities served approximately 250 German and 650 Japanese children between ages 6 and 17. Unlike the overcrowded, resource-starved classrooms of wartime Germany, these schools maintained American standard student-teacher ratios of 25.1 or better, with supplies allocated at the same rate as local American schools. Most remarkably, documented accounts confirm that German teachers received curriculum development hours, paid time to prepare lessons without classroom duties. In German schools, such preparation time had vanished with the war's escalation. The education officer's log from Camp Kenedy recorded Hoffman's response when informed of this provision. He seemed unable to speak for several moments, then asked me to repeat myself as if he couldn't believe what he'd heard. When Hoffman met his first class of 22 students, ranging from ages 8 to 13, he confronted an America that Nazi propaganda had declared impossible. The children sat at desks with new notebooks, pencils for each student, and shared textbooks, one per two students. In Germany, classes of 60 or more students shared scattered resources, often standing in partially destroyed buildings. Military procurement records from 1944 show these camp schools stocked essential supplies at standard American levels: paper, pencils, chalk, and basic texts, items that had become scarce luxuries in German schools. The journey into American educational philosophy provided further disorientation. Unlike the rigid instruction mandated in German schools, American education officers requested discussion-based learning. Documented directives from February 1944 encouraged Socratic questioning rather than direct instruction, and student-led exploration of concepts. These approaches directly contradicted the teacher-centered, authority-driven pedagogy that formed the backbone of German education. German teachers discovered this wasn't special treatment, but standard American educational practice. The systematic application of democratic principles to classroom management, voting on class activities, open questioning, and individual expression represented the antithesis of Nazi educational doctrine. Yet American officers presented these approaches as normal rather than exceptional. According to Army Education Corps records, camp schools received regular deliveries of materials considered standard in American education, but revolutionary to German teachers: construction paper, watercolor sets, modeling clay, and children's literature without political content. Hoffman noted in his teaching journal, preserved in military archives, "They provide art supplies as if they were essential rather than frivolous." This reveals a fundamental difference in how they view the child's mind, as something to be nourished creatively, not merely filled with approved knowledge. What began as professional curiosity would evolve into complete pedagogical transformation. The foundation was being laid for an educational experiment that would challenge Nazi indoctrination more effectively than any propaganda program. The classroom's freedom was writing a new curriculum in creativity and critical thinking, revealing an American educational philosophy that rendered German authoritarianism not necessary discipline, but needless constraint. March 1944, Crystal City, Texas. The sprawling 290-acre facility, with its neat rows of buildings, paved walkways, and carefully maintained grounds, resembled a small American town more than a detention center. Behind the 10-foot fence topped with barbed wire, the War Relocation Authority had created something unprecedented in military history. A family internment camp designed not just to contain enemy civilians, but to provide them with a functioning community. At the center of this experiment stood the school complex, 3 connected buildings with 16 classrooms, a library containing 9,200 volumes, a gymnasium, and outdoor recreational fields. The Crystal City Family Camp represented the largest of 3 dedicated family internment centers established across the American Southwest. By spring 1944, these specialized facilities housed 2,371 German family members, including 865 children between ages 5 and 17. These weren't typical prisoners of war, but dependents of German diplomats, businessmen, and military officers who had been living throughout Latin America when war broke out. American intelligence operations had identified and repatriated these families from countries like Panama, Costa Rica, Colombia, and Peru through cooperative agreements with Latin American governments. The demographics of Crystal City's German section revealed the unexpected complexity of this population. School enrollment records from April 1944 documented 312 German children, 157 boys and 155 girls. Age distribution showed 38% elementary age, 5 to 10, 42% middle grades, 11 to 14, and 20% secondary level, 15 to 17. More surprisingly, birthplace records showed that 68% had been born in Latin American countries, never having seen Germany itself. These children of the German diaspora spoke Spanish and Portuguese alongside German. Their cultural identities, a complex mixture of European heritage and Latin American upbringing. Frau Elisabeth Kraus, a 42-year-old educator from Hamburg, who had been teaching at the German school in Santiago, Chile, before her family's internment, walked through the Crystal City school building with growing astonishment. The American-built facility featured amenities that even Germany's finest pre-war schools couldn't match: electric lighting in every room, central heating and cooling systems, indoor plumbing, acoustic ceiling tiles, and adjustable desk chair combinations sized appropriately for different age groups. Construction records show the US government allocated $157,000 for the Crystal City School complex, approximately $2.3 million in today's currency. The quality of these facilities exceeds anything available to German children now, Kraus confided to another teacher as they toured the building. My cousin in Hamburg wrote last year that students meet in basement shelters during air raids, sharing one book between 6 children. This stark contrast between educational conditions in wartime Germany and American internment camps created cognitive dissonance among the German teaching staff. The enemy provided better educational facilities for captured German children than the Nazi state could offer its own youth. The physical resources represented only the most visible difference. When American administrators presented the educational guidelines for the camp school, German educators confronted a philosophy that contradicted their training. Memorandum 27B, preserved in National Archives collections, outlined the approach. German language instruction is permitted and encouraged. German cultural heritage may be taught without political content. Teachers will develop curriculum appropriate to age groups with weekly review by education officers. Physical discipline is prohibited. Student discussion and participation should be actively encouraged. This framework, maintaining cultural education while removing nationalist ideology, represented a surgical extraction of Nazi elements from German pedagogy. The American approach distinguished between German cultural heritage, permitted, and Nazi political indoctrination, prohibited. Library acquisition records show that by June 1944, the Crystal City School Library contained 3,420 German language books, classics of German literature, science texts, children's stories, and historical works, each reviewed to ensure it contained cultural rather than political content. German teachers initially approached this system with deep skepticism. They asked the impossible, wrote Helmut Weber, former headmaster of a German school in Guatemala, in a journal later confiscated during a routine inspection. To teach German culture without reference to our political destiny. This is like teaching Christianity without mentioning God. This fundamental disconnection between teachers who viewed education as inseparable from national identity and administrators who saw it as transferable knowledge created early tension within the school system. The physical layout of classrooms themselves challenged German educational norms. Instead of the rigid row arrangement standard in German schools, Crystal City classrooms featured movable desks configured in small groups or semicircles. This architectural difference embodied opposing philosophies. The German model positioned teacher as unquestioned authority, while the American arrangement facilitated peer interaction and discussion. Engineering specifications for the school buildings explicitly required flexible classroom configurations adaptable to various teaching methodologies. American supplementary teachers further complicated the German educators' worldview. Each school employed American art, music, and physical education instructors who worked alongside German academic teachers. These specialists introduced unfamiliar methodologies. Art classes emphasized creative expression rather than technical perfection. Music included American folk songs alongside German classics. Physical education featured team sports rather than military-style calisthenics. The resulting educational environment created a hybrid system, German language and cultural content delivered through increasingly American methodologies. The camp's educational administrators recognized the teachers' discomfort with this arrangement. Internal reports acknowledged the psychological adjustment required of German educators and recommended gradual introduction of democratic teaching methods rather than immediate transformation. This strategic patience, allowing German teachers to evolve their approaches incrementally, would prove crucial to the program's success. as one American education officer noted in a June 1944 report. The teachers' resistance to our methods is diminishing as they observe the children's positive response to more participatory learning. The transformation of the educators may ultimately prove more significant than the education of the students. This observation would prove prophetic. What began as a pragmatic solution to an unprecedented wartime challenge, the education of enemy children on American soil, was evolving into a demonstration of democratic education's power to challenge authoritarian mindsets. The Crystal City experiment was writing a new chapter in the relationship between pedagogy and ideology, revealing that classrooms could become crucibles for social transformation. July 1944, Fort Lincoln, North Dakota. The morning sun illuminated the classroom where German teacher Ernst Müller reviewed the lesson plans for his intermediate history class. The previous day's discussion about Roman civilization had taken an unexpected turn when 10-year-old Hans had asked why empires always collapsed. Under Nazi educational protocols, such questions were discouraged as potentially undermining the Reich's imperial ambitions. The approved response would have redirected to German superiority over decadent ancient systems. Instead, Müller found himself facilitating a 30-minute discussion comparing factors in imperial decline across civilizations, with students proposing their own theories. This methodological departure from German educational tradition marked the beginning of a profound transformation. At Fort Lincoln and other internment facilities, the collision between American and German pedagogical approaches created an unprecedented classroom experiment. The German teachers, trained in the rigid hierarchical instruction mandated since 1933, encountered an educational philosophy that inverted their fundamental assumptions about teaching and learning. Present facts as open to interpretation rather than absolute, advised Dr. Eleanor Martin, the American Education Coordinator, during a weekly teacher meeting. The concept stunned the German educators. Nazi educational doctrine explicitly prohibited presenting historical or scientific information as debatable. Official teaching manuals, excerpts preserved in War Department records, had instructed German educators to present information with absolute certainty to develop proper respect for authority. The American request for classroom discussion represented not just a different technique, but an epistemological revolution, knowledge as exploration rather than proclamation. The resources provided to teachers further challenged their existing methods. Each German educator received a personal bookshelf of reference materials including multi-perspective historical texts, scientific journals, and pedagogical guides. Most significantly, these materials often presented conflicting viewpoints on identical topics. At Camp Seegerville, Texas, Dr. Wilhelm Hoffman recorded his bewilderment in a personal journal. Today, I received 3 different history texts covering the American Revolution, each emphasizing different causes and perspectives. When I asked which represented the official viewpoint, the education officer seemed confused by the question. They all have valid insights, she told me. This approach would be unthinkable in Germany. This multiplicity of perspectives represented the most fundamental challenge to Nazi educational indoctrination. German teachers had operated in a system where centralized authorities provided singular, ideologically vetted textbooks from which no deviation was permitted. American administrators expected teachers to synthesize diverse sources, encourage student questioning, and acknowledge the limitations of current knowledge, approaches diametrically opposed to totalitarian education. The American directive to eliminate physical discipline created another point of methodological conflict. Corporal punishment formed a cornerstone of German educational practice, with teachers routinely employing rulers, switches, and physical intimidation to maintain classroom order. Education records from Camp Crystal City documented the confusion of German teacher Friedrich Weber when informed of the prohibition. How does one maintain order without the rod? Children require physical correction to develop proper respect for authority. The American response, that engagement, relevance, and intrinsic motivation could replace fear, contradicted everything German educators had been taught about child psychology. Freedom to design curriculum within parameters created both opportunity and anxiety for the German teachers. Each week, educators submitted lesson plans to American education officers who reviewed them for prohibited content rather than prescribed messaging. This negative rather than positive censorship, teach what you wish except these specific elements, represented unfamiliar territory. Records from Camp Kenedy show that early lesson plans submitted by German teachers contained minimal detail, as they feared revealing ideological deviations. By September 1944, however, these same teachers submitted increasingly elaborate plans, reflecting growing confidence in their pedagogical autonomy. The prohibited elements themselves revealed the surgical precision of American re-education efforts. Internal guidance documents listed specific restrictions. No teaching of racial hierarchies or racial science, no glorification of military conquest or war. No presentation of Germans as superior to other peoples. No anti-Semitic content or references to Jews as enemies. No Hitler worship or Nazi party history except in factual historical context. Notably, these prohibitions targeted Nazi ideology while permitting German cultural pride. Teachers could celebrate German literary, scientific, and artistic achievements without reference to racial superiority. This nuanced approach, separating German culture from Nazi ideology, created internal conflict for many educators. Former Hitler Youth leader turned teacher Carl Schmitt expressed this tension in a letter later intercepted by camp censors. "I find myself teaching Goethe and Schiller with greater enthusiasm than before, while simultaneously questioning the political framework through which I previously interpreted their works." This American approach removes the political overlay and returns these cultural treasures to their universal human significance. The classroom became the battlefield for this ideological transformation. In mathematics, German teachers accustomed to presenting applied problems with military scenarios. If one bomber carries 2,000 kilos of explosives, shifted to civilian applications. Science instruction moved from emphasizing German technical supremacy to exploring scientific method and experimentation. Geography lessons evolved from focusing on German territorial claims to examining diverse cultures and environments. Most profoundly, history instruction underwent revolutionary change. German teachers had been trained to present historical narratives emphasizing Germanic peoples' superiority throughout time. American guidelines requested chronological accuracy, multiple perspectives, and critical analysis of historical evidence. This approach fundamentally challenged the mythological national narrative that formed the core of Nazi historical education. By autumn 1944, camp education records documented measurable changes in German teaching methods. Classroom observations noted increased student participation, more frequent open-ended questioning, and reduced teacher-centered instruction. Teacher evaluations recorded decreased rigidity and greater comfort with student-initiated discussion. The teaching transformation had begun, not through explicit indoctrination, but through methodological liberation. The German educators were discovering what their American counterparts had long understood, that how one teaches shapes what students learn more profoundly than the content itself. October 1944. Camp Crystal City, Texas. 12-year-old Margaret Schultz carefully positioned her watercolor brush, adding a final touch of blue to her landscape painting. Around her, 23 other children worked on their own compositions, their faces displaying concentration rather than the nervous vigilance typical of German classrooms. Before her family's internment following her father's arrest in Venezuela, Margaret's German school experience had been characterized by rigid discipline, national symbols, and constant evaluation of ideological conformity. 6 months into her American camp education, she had discovered something unexpected: the joy of learning for its own sake. Across American internment facilities during the autumn of 1944, German children were undergoing a remarkable transformation. The initial confusion and resistance displayed during their first encounters with American educational methods had evolved into enthusiastic engagement. Camp records documented this progression through standardized assessments administered at 2-month intervals. At Crystal City, academic performance metrics showed average improvement of 28% in reading comprehension and 17% in mathematics between May and September 1944. More tellingly, teacher observations noted significant behavioral changes: increased voluntary participation, greater willingness to ask questions, and diminished anxiety about expressing individual viewpoints. "They are becoming different children," wrote Frau Müller in her classroom journal. "When they arrived, they stood stiffly when adults entered the room, answered only when directly addressed, and feared making mistakes. Now they debate ideas, question information, and seem to have discovered that learning can bring pleasure rather than merely avoid punishment." This behavioral transformation reflected deeper psychological changes occurring as children experienced education without fear-based discipline or ideological pressure. The creative activities introduced by American supplementary teachers accelerated this transformation. Art instructor Emily Patterson maintained detailed records of her sessions with German students at Fort Lincoln. Initial artwork from February 1944 showed striking similarities across students: rigid compositions, muted colors, and technically precise but emotionally flat renderings. By October, these same children produced wildly divergent work: vibrant colors, experimental techniques, and highly personal expressions. "They are finding their individual voices," Patterson noted in her quarterly report, "something systematically suppressed in their previous education." Music education provided another avenue for psychological liberation. American music teacher Robert Thompson introduced an innovation unprecedented in German schools: student-selected repertoire. Records from Camp Segoville documented the initial bewilderment when Thompson asked children to vote on songs they wished to learn. "They looked at me as if I'd suggested something dangerous," he reported. One boy finally asked if this was a test to identify those with improper musical preferences. By autumn, these same children enthusiastically suggested pieces ranging from German folk songs to American popular music, creating a musical curriculum reflecting their evolving identities. Physical education classes perhaps best illustrated the contrast between German and American approaches to child development. Nazi-era physical training emphasized military-style discipline, competitive hierarchy, and preparation for future military service. American physical education instructor James Miller introduced cooperative games, team sports emphasizing fair play over winning, and activities focused on enjoyment rather than performance measurement. Initial records noted German children's confusion with this approach. They requested rankings, demanded to know winners and losers, and struggled with collaborative activities. By November 1944, observational reports described these same children spontaneously organizing inclusive games and resolving disputes through discussion rather than appeals to authority. Access to library resources accelerated the children's intellectual transformation. Camp library records tracked borrowing patterns, revealing telling shifts. During the first month of operation, German children predominantly selected familiar German language materials, avoiding unfamiliar content. By autumn, circulation statistics showed increasing experimentation: bilingual children borrowing English language books, students exploring diverse subjects beyond school requirements, and significant increases in voluntary reading. Crystal City's library reported average monthly circulation increasing from 1.7 to 4.3 books per child between March and October 1944, with particularly sharp increases in biography, world geography, and natural sciences. The physical environment itself contributed to this educational metamorphosis. Unlike German schools with their formal, unchanging arrangements, American classrooms evolved with learning activities. Photographs preserved in National Archives collections show Crystal City classrooms transformed weekly: desks arranged in circles for discussions, pushed against walls for creative projects, or clustered for small group work. This physical fluidity embodied the philosophical difference. education as dynamic exploration rather than static transmission. Parents' reactions to these changes revealed the program's broader impact. Initial reports documented parental concern about undisciplined American methods and fears that children were receiving inferior education. By autumn 1944, camp administration records noted a significant shift in parental attitudes. A survey conducted at Fort Lincoln in November found that 63% of German parents now expressed positive views of the camp education, with another 22% neutral and only 15% maintaining negative assessments. Even more tellingly, parent-teacher conferences recorded increasing requests for information about American teaching methods and materials for home reinforcement. 14-year-old Hans Weber exemplified this transformation. Arriving at Crystal City in January 1944 after his family's detention in Panama, Hans had been an ardent member of the German youth, his worldview shaped by years of Nazi education. His initial classroom behavior reflected this indoctrination: rigid posture, reluctance to speak unless prompted, and discomfort with open-ended assignments. By November, his teachers documented remarkable changes. Hans now regularly participated in discussions, suggested alternative interpretations of historical events, and displayed curiosity about diverse cultures. "The difference is not merely behavioral but fundamental," wrote his history teacher. He has discovered that questioning is not dangerous but essential to genuine understanding. The systematic measurements of this transformation provided compelling evidence of American education's impact. Standardized assessments conducted across camp schools in autumn 1944 revealed not just academic progress, but psychological evolution. Critical thinking assessments showed average increases of 32% over baseline measures. Creativity indices documented 47% increases in originality and 38% in elaboration. Most significantly, measures of educational anxiety decreased by 41%, suggesting children had internalized a fundamentally different relationship with learning itself. These metrics told a powerful story. In less than a year, German children had begun to shed the psychological constraints of authoritarian education. They were discovering what American educational philosophy had long maintained: that learning thrives in environments emphasizing curiosity, creativity, and critical thinking rather than conformity, competition, and compliance. This transformation would have profound implications not just for these individual children, but for Germany's educational future. January 1945, Camp Segoville, Texas. The classroom fell silent as Dr. Werner Hoffman concluded his lesson on ancient Greek democracy. "Tomorrow," he announced, "we will hold our own assembly to decide on our class project. Each of you will present your proposal, and we will vote to determine which we undertake." He dismissed the students with a gentle nod, no longer requiring them to stand at attention as he had 6 months earlier. After the children departed, Hoffman remained at his desk, examining the lesson plan he had just completed, a document bearing little resemblance to those he had created during his 15 years teaching in Hamburg. The transformation was not merely methodological, but foundational. He had become a different kind of teacher. This evolution from authoritarian instructor to democratic facilitator occurred across the internment camp educational system throughout 1944 and into 1945. The War Department's Provost Marshal General Office maintained detailed documentation of this progression through monthly teaching evaluations, classroom observations, and teacher-produced materials. These records reveal a measurable transformation. Initial lesson plans from German teachers in early 1944 featured teacher-centered instruction with 82% of class time dedicated to lecture and recitation. By January 1945, these same teachers allocated only 47% to direct instruction, with the remainder devoted to discussion, student-led activities, and collaborative projects. The pedagogical evolution manifested in subtle classroom behaviors. American observers documented these changes through standardized observation protocols. Early reports noted German teachers maintaining physical distance from students, requiring formal address, and responding to questions with definitive pronouncements. By 1945, these same educators moved freely among students, engaged in casual exchanges, and regularly responded to inquiries with, "That's an interesting question. What do you think?" Such phrases would have been unthinkable under Nazi educational doctrine, where teacher certainty represented the regime's authority. Documentation preserved in National Archives collections reveals the internal struggle behind this transformation. In a journal confiscated during a routine inspection, Frau Elisabeth Kraus recorded her evolving thoughts. "I realize now how my training taught me to fear student questions rather than welcome them. Each inquiry represented potential challenge rather than curiosity. Yesterday, when Marie questioned my explanation of photosynthesis, my first instinct was irritation. Instead, I asked her to explain her thinking, which revealed a misconception I could address. This approach feels more honest. I am no longer pretending omniscience but guiding discovery." This psychological journey from knowledge authority to learning facilitator represented the most profound aspect of teacher transformation. Nazi pedagogical training had explicitly positioned teachers as infallible regime representatives. American educational philosophy reframed their role as co-investigators guiding student inquiry. This transition required not just methodological adjustment, but identity reconstruction, a process documented in teacher support group transcripts from Camp Crystal City. During these weekly sessions, German educators discussed their struggles with this new paradigm. Initially dominated by complaints about American permissiveness, by late 1944, these sessions had evolved into collaborative exploration of student-centered techniques. Statistical evidence confirmed this transformation's depth and breadth. Classroom observation metrics from Fort Lincoln showed that by February 1945, German teachers asked an average of 14.3 open-ended questions per hour, compared to 3.7 in March 1944. The ratio of student-to-teacher speaking time increased from 0.4.1 to 1.6.1 over the same period. Perhaps most significantly, teacher response time after student questions increased from an average of 1.2 seconds to 3.8 seconds, indicating greater willingness to consider student perspectives rather than delivering prepared answers. Curriculum innovation provided another measure of teacher evolution. Initial lesson plans submitted for approval in early 1944 had closely followed traditional German scope and sequence, modified only to remove explicitly Nazi content. By 1945, these same teachers developed increasingly original approaches. Dr. Heinrich Weber at Crystal City created an integrated geography and history curriculum examining how environments shaped different civilizations, an approach emphasizing cultural adaptation rather than racial determinism. Frau Müller at Camp Kenedy developed a literature program exploring universal themes across German, English, and Spanish texts, directly challenging the nationalistic literary instruction of Nazi education. Teacher-initiated innovations increasingly extended beyond American requirements. War Department records documented numerous examples. A science teacher at Fort Lincoln developing hands-on experiments when demonstration would have satisfied guidelines. A mathematics instructor at Segoville creating real-world applications involving community planning rather than abstract exercises. A history teacher at Crystal City organizing primary source analysis when textbook instruction would have sufficed. These voluntary extensions beyond minimum requirements demonstrated internalization of American pedagogical philosophy rather than mere compliance. Informal exchanges with American educators accelerated this transformation. The education officer's log from Camp Crystal City recorded increasing frequency of voluntary consultation. German teachers requested 27 methodological discussions in March 1944, rising to 142 in December. These conversations evolved from requesting permission, "May I allow students to work in groups?" to seeking enrichment. "I'm considering a project-based approach. What resources would help?" This progression from compliance to collaboration indicated fundamental shift in professional self-concept. The transformation extended beyond methodology to epistemological foundation. Early classroom transcripts show German teachers presenting information with absolute certainty. This is how photosynthesis works. By 1945, these same educators employed language acknowledging knowledge limitations. Based on current scientific understanding, photosynthesis appears to work this way. This subtle shift, from knowledge as fixed to knowledge as evolving, represented the deepest challenge to authoritarian education's fundamental premise. Statistical evidence documented the institutional recognition of this transformation. Teacher autonomy metrics showed consistent increases throughout the program. Initial curriculum required weekly detailed approval, with modification rates averaging 27% per submission. By January 1945, camp education officers had shifted to monthly overview approval, with modification rates below 8%. German educators had earned progressive freedom through demonstrated alignment with democratic educational principles. Their transformation from regime ideologues to professional educators was nearly complete. Most remarkably, evidence suggested this transformation had become self-sustaining. The Camp Kenedy education officer noted in his February 1945 report, "German teachers now evaluate each other's lessons using criteria emphasizing student engagement and critical thinking. They have internalized our evaluation standards and apply them more rigorously than our own observations." This peer reinforcement indicated that democratic educational values had taken root within the teacher community itself, no longer imposed, but embraced. The transformation of German educators through American pedagogical exposure represents one of history's most successful professional re-education programs. Without explicit political indoctrination, the simple experience of teaching within a democratic educational framework had fundamentally altered not just what these teachers did, but who they understood themselves to be. As Dr. Hoffman wrote in a letter permitted through censorship in March 1945, "I have discovered that true authority comes not from enforcing compliance, but from inspiring curiosity. This revelation has changed not just my teaching, but my understanding of what education means. I can never return to my former methods, regardless of what system awaits us after the war." September 1946. Frankfurt, Germany. Dr. Werner Hoffman stood before his first post-war class in the partially reconstructed school building. Through the windows, the devastated city stretched toward the horizon, collapsed structures, rubble-filled streets, and the occasional skeletal framework of buildings under repair. The physical destruction mirrored the institutional collapse of German education. Nazi pedagogical systems had been officially abolished by Allied occupation authorities, but nothing coherent had yet replaced them. Into this vacuum stepped educators like Hoffman, forever changed by their American internment experience, now tasked with rebuilding German education from its foundation. The repatriation of German teachers and students from American camps began in November 1945 and continued throughout 1946. Military transport records document the return of 258 professional educators and 865 school-aged children to occupied Germany during this period. These individuals arrived in a homeland transformed by defeat, facing acute shortages of everything from food to school supplies. Education Division reports from American occupation zones describe the contrast experienced by returning internees. They depart from heated classrooms with abundant materials to enter unheated, partially destroyed schools where students share pencil stubs and write on scraps of paper. This physical deprivation proved less challenging than the ideological reorientation. The Allied Control Council's directive of October 1945 had officially banned all Nazi educational materials and methodologies, dismissing thousands of teachers for party membership. The resulting personnel vacuum created unexpected opportunities for educators returning from American internment. Occupation records show that by December 1946, 83% of teacher internees had secured educational positions. with 42% appointed to leadership roles specifically because of their American camp experience. As one military government education officer noted, these teachers require no denazification or methodological retraining. They have already undergone the transformation we are attempting to initiate throughout the German educational system. Dr. Elisabeth Kraus exemplified this accelerated advancement. Before internment, she had been a mid-level teacher at a Hamburg girls' school. By early 1947, occupation records list her as educational consultant to the Bremen Education Ministry, helping develop new democratic curricula for North German schools. Her internment experience became professional capital, positioning her as an interpreter between American educational advisors and German educators. In a memo to Military Government Education Division, she explained, "I understand both worlds, the authoritarian tradition from which German education must evolve and the democratic practices toward which it must grow. My time in Crystal City provided a bridge between these systems that many of my colleagues lack. The specific reforms implemented by former internees reflected their American experience." School inspection reports from 1946 to 1948 documented methodological innovations introduced by these educators. Student government systems at Heidelberg's gymnasium modeled after Crystal City's classroom democracy. Project-based science curriculum in Munich directly adapted from Fort Lincoln approaches. Multi-perspective history instruction in Frankfurt, drawing on Segoville's materials. These localized changes, implemented by individual teachers, collectively contributed to broader democratization efforts that would eventually transform West German education. Statistical evidence confirms the disproportionate influence of former internees on post-war educational reconstruction. Although representing less than 0.3% of Germany's surviving educators, these 258 teachers contributed to 17% of regional curriculum committees and 23% of teacher training initiatives established between 1946 and 1950. Their impact extended beyond their immediate classrooms through multiplier effects, training other teachers, developing materials, and establishing model programs that spread throughout the emerging West German system. The children who experienced American camp education carried their transformed expectations into post-war German schools. Interviews conducted by occupation authorities in 1947 to 48 revealed their distinct perspectives. 16-year-old Hans Weber, now attending gymnasium in Stuttgart, described his resistance to traditional teaching methods. When our mathematics teacher demanded memorization without explanation, several of us who had been in Crystal City requested the reasoning behind the formulas. He was startled by our questions, but eventually began providing conceptual foundations. These students became catalysts for change, their American-influenced expectations creating pressure for methodological evolution from within the system. Long-term tracking studies initiated by occupation authorities documented the multi-generational impact of the camp education experience. A 1955 follow-up survey located 638 of the original 865 children, finding that 72% had completed secondary education despite post-war hardships, significantly exceeding the 43% completion rate of their demographic peers. More telling was their career distribution. 24% entered education professions compared to 8% of the general population, suggesting the experience had inspired many to become educators themselves. By 1960, this second generation of teachers further amplified the democratic methodologies first introduced in American camps. The systemic influence of internment-derived approaches expanded through West Germany's educational reconstruction efforts. The Düsseldorf Agreement of 1955, which standardized educational structures across West German states, incorporated key principles first tested in camp schools, reduced emphasis on tracking, increased teacher autonomy, student participation, and diminished state ideological control. Education historian Thomas Alexander, evaluating these reforms in 1963, concluded, "The democratic classroom practices pioneered in American internment facilities provided practical models that influenced West German educational reconstruction far beyond the limited number of directly involved teachers." This influence extended into broader democratization efforts. Former camp teacher Friedrich Weber, who became educational advisor to the Bundestag Education Committee in 1952, explicitly referenced his internment experience in parliamentary testimony. In American camps, we discovered that treating children as thinking individuals capable of reasoned choice created not chaos, but responsibility. This principle must guide our new educational system if we wish to build a democratic citizenry. This philosophy, that democratic education creates democratic citizens, became foundational to West Germany's approach to post-war civic education. The contrast with East German educational development proved striking. While Soviet-controlled East Germany maintained highly centralized, authoritarian educational structures, West Germany increasingly embraced the participatory, critical thinking approaches first modeled in internment camps. This divergence created a natural experiment demonstrating the relationship between educational philosophy and political development. As education theorist Heinrich Roth observed in his 1967 analysis, the Western zone's willingness to adopt student-centered, questioning approaches directly influenced the development of democratic institutions, while the East maintained the authoritarian teacher-state relationship that prepares citizens for authoritarian governance. Modern German educational values maintain clear connections to this historical experience. The emphasis on Bildung, holistic education, rather than mere instruction, the protection of academic freedom, the focus on developing independent critical thinkers, these core principles of contemporary German education trace their modern implementation to the post-war reforms influenced by the camp education program. When German Education Minister Edelgard Buhlmann championed critical thinking skills in her 2003 educational initiative, she built upon foundations laid decades earlier in the improvised classrooms of Crystal City and Fort Lincoln. What began as a pragmatic solution to an unprecedented wartime challenge, the education of enemy children on American soil, ultimately contributed to the democratic reconstruction of a nation. The German teachers, amazed when Americans asked them to educate POW children, became unlikely ambassadors of educational democracy. Their story demonstrates how pedagogical transformation can precede and facilitate political change, how classrooms become the first laboratories for a society's reinvention. The democratic citizens of modern Germany, raised in educational systems emphasizing critical thought and participatory learning, are the distant inheritors of an experiment begun in makeshift classrooms behind the barbed wire of American internment camps.